The first time humanity spoke in front of the entire galaxy, nobody took them seriously. And honestly, that was expected. Think about it from the outside. Earth had only been a part of the Galactic conclave for a little over a decade. 10 years. That is nothing when you are sitting in a room full of civilizations that have been sailing between stars for thousands of years. Some of those species had colonies on 100 worlds. Some of them had fleets so large they could block out a sun. Some of them had been watching humanity from a distance for centuries, back when we were still figuring out how to build roads. So when a small blue-green planet finally got a seat at the table, most of the galaxy smiled, nodded, and waited for the humans to sit quietly and learn how things worked. That was not what happened. The conclave chambers were enormous. They had to be. 47 civilizations sent representatives, and each species came with its own delegation, its own protocols, its own way of moving and breathing and existing. The air inside was processed 17 different ways at once to keep everyone comfortable. The lighting shifted in slow, subtle cycles because some species could not see in the same spectrum as others. The translators, small floating drones the size of a fist, hovered near every speaker and pushed words into every language simultaneously. It was, in other words, the most important room in the known galaxy. Earth's representative was a woman named Ambassador Voss. She was not a soldier, not a politician in the traditional sense, not a scientist. She was something harder to define, the kind of person who had spent her life watching, listening, and understanding things before she spoke. She had gray in her hair and steady eyes, and she carried herself the way people do when they have nothing left to prove. The session that day was mostly routine. A border dispute between two older species. A resource-sharing agreement in the outer systems. Trade routes. Infrastructure. The usual business of a galaxy trying to keep itself organized. Human affairs were not on the official agenda. Ambassador Voss asked for the floor anyway. There was a pause. The kind of pause that happens when someone unexpected raises their hand. A few of the older delegates shifted. The Vrethkai representative, tall, 8-limbed, with compound eyes that caught the light, tilted its head in what translated loosely as mild curiosity mixed with faint amusement. Voss walked to the center of the chamber. She did not carry notes. She did not use a prepared speech. She simply stood there for a moment, looked out at the assembled faces of 47 civilizations, and then she spoke. She told them, in plain and simple language, exactly who humanity was, not in a boastful way. She did not list military statistics or technological achievements. She did not make promises about what Earth could offer the galaxy or how valuable a partner humanity would be. She did not speak the way most new members spoke, eager to impress, eager to fit in. She spoke like someone leaving a record. "We are a young species," she said. "We know that. We have made more mistakes than most of you can probably count. We have hurt each other, damaged our own world, and spent most of our history learning lessons the hard way. We are not perfect. We are not the strongest people in this room. and we are not the oldest. We know our place." She paused. "But there is one thing I want this conclave to understand about us, clearly. Before we go any further, we are slow to anger. It takes a great deal to push us past a certain point. But once we reach that point, we do not stop. We do not forget. And we do not give up. Ever." She looked around the room. "I say this not as a threat. I say it as a courtesy, so that no one here can later claim they were not warned." She walked back to her seat. For about 3 seconds, the chamber was genuinely, completely silent. Then the laughter started. It was not cruel laughter, exactly. It was more like the laughter of people who had just heard something charming but slightly ridiculous, the way you might laugh at a child who announces with total seriousness that one day they are going to climb the tallest mountain. Sweet, confident, completely unaware of how big the mountain actually is. The Vrethkai were the loudest. Their laughter came out as a rapid, clicking sound, something between a drum roll and static, and it spread through their section of the gallery quickly. Within moments, it had rippled outward. Other species joined in, some with sounds, some with gestures, some with light patterns that their translators marked simply as amusement. A junior delegate from one of the older civilizations leaned over to a colleague and said something. The translator caught it. Did they actually just threaten the entire conclave? The colleague's response: "I think they thought they were being polite." More laughter. Ambassador Voss sat through all of it without moving, without reacting. She folded her hands on the table in front of her and looked straight ahead with an expression that was impossible to read. Not embarrassed, not angry, not amused, just patient. The clip was broadcast across the open channels before the session even ended. By the next day, it had reached 1,000 star systems. Within a week, it was everywhere. The human ambassador, standing alone in the middle of the largest diplomatic chamber in the known galaxy, telling 47 ancient civilizations to consider themselves warned. It became a joke. A good-natured one, mostly the kind of joke that is told with a kind of affection, the way people make fun of something they find endearing. The Vrethkai in particular seemed to love it. They played the clip at social gatherings. They used it as an example in academic discussions about how younger species often overestimated their own importance. One of their political comedians built an entire performance piece around it. Nobody on Earth said anything publicly about any of this. That was the part some of the older civilizations should have noticed if they had been paying attention. Not the speech itself. Not the confidence of it, or the steadiness of Voss standing there in front of the whole galaxy. Those things could be explained away. What should have caught someone's attention was the silence that followed. Most species, when they are laughed at, respond. They get defensive, or they apologize, or they try to explain themselves, or they get angry. There is almost always a reaction. It is just how most conscious, social beings work. You laugh at them. Earth's government issued no statement, no correction, no clarification, no complaint to the conclave about the way the clip was being used. The human delegates in the chambers continued showing up to every session, doing their work, filing their reports, voting on the things they were asked to vote on. Quiet, professional, present. It was as if they had said their piece, heard the laughter, made a note of it, and simply moved on. 3 years later, when the Vrethkai fleet arrived at a human colony world and burned it to the ground, some people in the conclave would remember that silence and feel something shift uncomfortably in the backs of their minds. But that was 3 years away. For now, the galaxy laughed, and Ambassador Voss sat with her hands folded, looking straight ahead, waiting. Nobody announced it as an act of war. That was the first thing to understand about what happened at Kessler's world. The Vrethkai did not send a declaration. They did not warn the colony, did not issue an ultimatum, did not try to negotiate for resources or land or whatever else they might have wanted. They simply arrived 3 warships and a fleet of transport vessels, and they began. It was fast. Horrifyingly fast. The colony on Kessler's world had been established 11 years earlier. It sat on the edge of a large river basin, sheltered by a range of low mountains on one side and open grassland on the other. The settlers had built it up slowly and carefully, homes first, then schools, then greenhouses, then community halls. They had planted trees that were only now starting to grow tall enough to provide real shade. There were children there who had been born on that world and had never seen Earth except in photographs. By the time any help could have arrived, 12 of the 17 settlements were gone. Not damaged. Gone. The structures had been reduced to flat, scorched ground. The kind of thoroughness that only happens when something is done deliberately and without hurry. 17,000 people were unaccounted for. The Vrethkai transport ships had taken them. When the news reached the conclave, the reaction was immediate and loud. Emergency sessions were called. Dozens of species sent messages of condolence to Earth's delegation. Several of the older civilizations offered to mediate. A few of the more powerful ones made carefully worded statements expressing concern and urging restraint from all parties. The conclave's administrative body began the process of formally reviewing what had happened under interstellar law. It was all very organized, very procedural, very slow. The Vrethkai ambassador appeared before the conclave 4 days after the attack. He was composed and formal, as Vrethkai officials always were in public settings. He expressed what he called deep regret over the incident. He used the word regrettable 4 times. He referenced a disputed resource survey from 6 years ago that apparently placed the Kessler Basin within a zone the Vrethkai Grand Hive had previously flagged as a potential area of interest. He proposed a joint commission to review the matter and suggested that a trade credit arrangement could be discussed as a gesture of goodwill. He did not use the word apology. Not once. He did not mention the 17,000 people his fleet had taken. A lot of the conclave members seemed prepared to work with this. Not because they approved of what had happened, most of them were genuinely troubled by it, but because the machinery of galactic diplomacy had certain grooves it liked to run in. And this situation, as ugly as it was, seemed to fit those grooves well enough. There would be a commission. There would be negotiations. Eventually, there would be some kind of settlement. It was how things worked. Earth's response came through the official channels the following morning. It was 3 sentences. We have noted the attack. We have recorded the names of everyone lost. We are coming. That was it. No further statement. No request for a commission. No counter-proposal. No list of demands. 3 sentences. Transmitted once, filed in the official record, and then silence. The reaction in the conclave was a strange mix of things. Some species found it alarming. A few of the older, more measured civilizations quietly reached out to Earth's delegation to ask if there was something more formal being prepared, some actual diplomatic position that humanity intended to take. They were told, politely, that Earth had said what it needed to say. Several others found it almost comforting in a strange way, as if the bluntness of it meant humanity was just venting, and that after a few weeks of cooling down, they would come back to the table like everyone else. The Vrethkai found it funny. A junior diplomat from the Grand Hive, young, ambitious, clearly trying to impress the right people, was quoted at a social gathering, saying that the humans were barking like a planet that had not yet learned its place. He said it with a clicking laugh, the Vrethkai equivalent of a smirk, and the people around him responded in kind. The quote made its way through the diplomatic channels within hours. Most people who heard it passed it along with amusement. It was the kind of line that travels fast because it sounds clever and lands easily. It was also archived. Automatically, like all official communications. Stored in a database somewhere, time-stamped and filed. Nobody thought much about that at the time. On Kessler's world, or what was left of it, Commander Hassan had arrived with the first wave of relief teams. He was a military officer by training but had spent most of the last decade doing humanitarian coordination, getting resources to places that needed them, organizing evacuations, managing crises that were too messy for clean solutions. He was the kind of person who got sent somewhere when things were already very bad. He stood in the ash of what had once been the colony's main settlement and looked at it for a long time. There was not much to see. A few structural remnants, the outline of where roads had been, the ghost of a town. Then he opened his datapad and started a new file. Name by name, he began building the list. Every person who had lived in those 17 settlements. Ages. Occupations. Last known locations. Family connections. He pulled from colony records, from communications logs, from the accounts of the small number of survivors who had managed to get away in the chaos. He worked through the night and into the next day, and when his team arrived and asked what he needed, he told them to start verifying. 17,211 names. When the count was finally done, he looked at the number for a while. Then he saved the file, labeled it simply with the colony's name and the date, and got back to work. Up in orbit, the conclave observers were filing their own reports. Preliminary assessments, documentation of the destruction, statements that would eventually feed into the formal review process. One of the observers from a species that had been part of the conclave for 800 years sent a private message to a colleague back home that evening. The message said, The humans are taking this very quietly. I am not sure whether that is a good sign or not. His colleague replied, probably good. Young species need time to process grief before they act irrationally. Give them a few months, and they will be ready to negotiate. Also. After 4. Neither of them knew about the list. Back in the conclave chambers, the weeks that followed the attack settled into a familiar rhythm. The formal review commission was assembled. Procedural motions were filed. Earth's delegation attended every session, voted on the things they were asked to vote on, sat through hours of deliberation about jurisdictional frameworks and evidentiary standards. They were polite, engaged, offered nothing extra. Ambassador Voss, when she was asked directly by another delegate whether Earth was prepared to enter mediation talks with the Vrithkai, gave a response that was short and perfectly civil. We appreciate the concern. Earth is handling this in its own way, in its own time. The delegate who asked assumed this meant humanity was still processing, still deciding, still working up to making a real move on the diplomatic board. What nobody in that room understood yet was that the move had already been made. Quietly, the moment those 3 sentences were transmitted, the moment Hassan landed on Kessler's world with his datapad and started writing down names. The galaxy operates on a certain assumption about how conflict works. A powerful species strikes a weaker one. The weaker one either submits or appeals to the broader community for protection. Negotiations happen. Settlements are reached. Life goes on. That assumption works because most species, when they are hurt, want the pain to stop. They want resolution. They want to get back to stability as fast as possible. The whole structure of galactic diplomacy is built on that instinct, the shared desire to find a way back to normal. What the Vrethkai had not accounted for, what almost nobody had accounted for, was a species that did not rush toward normal. A species that could sit with the weight of what had happened, carry it without buckling, and move deliberately. Humans had a long history of doing exactly that. It just had not come up before, out here among the stars. The junior Vrethkai diplomat who had made the barking joke was, by now, pleased with himself. The quote had gotten around. He had been invited to 2 more gatherings than usual that month. He was building a reputation as someone sharp and clever, someone worth watching. He had not been told that the quote had been archived. He had not been told that a list existed with 17,211 names on it. He had not been told because nobody yet knew that Earth had already stopped waiting for the conclave to do something. 3 years was not a long time. In galactic terms, civilizations measured themselves in centuries. A few years was a breath, a pause, barely a moment. For humanity, it was enough. Somewhere between the ash fields of Kessler's world and the well-lit corridors of the conclave, something had quietly shifted. A decision had been made, not in anger, not in haste, but with the kind of calm, settled finality that comes when people have thought something through completely and arrived at the same answer from every direction. They were coming. They had said so. Nobody had believed them. That was going to be a problem. The first disappearance was easy to explain away. Of HFY's scout fleet's 7 ships, standard patrol configuration, had been assigned to the outer edge of the Veth Nebula. Routine work. They checked in every 4 days on a fixed schedule. When they missed their first check-in, the communications officer on duty logged it as probable interference. The Veth Nebula was dense with electromagnetic activity. Signal loss happened out there. It had happened before. When they missed the second check-in, a search vessel was dispatched. The search vessel found nothing. No wreckage, no distress signals, no debris field. 7 ships do not simply vanish without leaving something behind, some fragment, some trace, some echo of what they were. But there was nothing. Just empty space where a fleet used to be. The report was filed. The matter was flagged for further investigation. The Grand Hive's analysts noted it as unusual and moved on to other things. 3 weeks later, a HFY resupply depot in the Keth corridor went dark. The depot was not a military installation, not exactly. It was a way station, the kind of facility that kept the logistical backbone of a multi-world empire running. Fuel reserves, parts, food stocks for crews on long runs. About 200 staff, mostly civilian contractors. It had been operating quietly and without incident for over 30 years. One morning it simply stopped transmitting. Again, a vessel was sent to investigate. Again, they found nothing they could easily explain. The depot was intact. No structural damage. No sign of any collision or catastrophic failure. But the fuel reserves were gone. The communication systems had been disabled in a very specific, very deliberate way. And the staff, all 200 of them, were gone. Not taken in the chaotic, burning way that Kessler's world had been taken. Quietly, carefully, with what looked, to the investigators, like a great deal of planning. They were found 3 days later on a habitable moon, 2 systems away, unharmed, with enough supplies to last a month. Someone had put them there. Someone had thought about where to put them so they would be safe and found quickly. The Grand Hive Security Council held an emergency meeting. The mood in that room was not panic, not yet, but it was something uncomfortable. Something that did not have a clean name. A scout fleet had vanished. A depot had been systematically stripped, and its staff relocated without a single casualty. Both operations had happened without any detection, without any warning, without any communication, before or after. Someone had done this. Someone patient enough to plan it, careful enough to execute it without leaving a trail. And in the case of the depot, deliberate enough to make sure no one got hurt. One of the council members said what several of them were thinking. "This does not look like piracy." Another replied, "No, it looks like a message." The lead analyst, who had been reviewing everything twice since the scout fleet disappeared, set down his notes and said quietly, "It looks like a beginning." Nobody wanted to say the word humans out loud. Not yet. It seemed too large a conclusion to draw from 2 incidents. The Grand Hive had enemies all powerful civilizations did. There were other candidates. Our human, the mosted, There were other possibilities. The analysts were told to keep their findings close and continue the investigation without drawing any formal conclusions. 4 weeks after that, a border garrison on the edge of HFY space stopped transmitting. Then a communication relay in the inner systems failed, not broke, failed, in the specific way things fail when they have been made to fail by someone who knows exactly what they are doing. Then 2 patrol ships disappeared near the edge of the Kessler system, which was, the analysts noted with growing unease, the system where the human colony had been. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Whatever was happening, it was not random. It was not opportunistic. Someone was moving through HFY space like a person walking through a house in the dark, not stumbling, not searching, but going directly to the things they had already decided to reach. The Grand Hive quietly doubled the security on its primary shipyard at Keth 3. Keth 3 was the crown of HFY military production, the facility where their largest warships were built, where their most advanced weapon systems were tested, where the structural heart of their fleet capability lived. If anything needed to be protected, it was Keth 3. They added 3 additional patrol wings. They upgraded the sensor arrays. They changed the access protocols and communication encryption. They did everything that a careful, experienced military civilization does when it realizes it may be under some kind of threat. They felt better after that, more secure. They had, without knowing it, just spent 2 months preparing to defend against the wrong thing. Commander Hassan's fleet had not been moving toward Keth 3. It had been moving through the spaces between things, the quiet corridors, the lightly watched routes, the stretches of deep space that showed up on maps, but never seemed important enough to guard carefully. For 2 years, human planners had studied every piece of publicly available information about HFY space. Trade routes, communication networks, supply chains, the locations of every relay, every depot, every outpost, every facility that kept the Grand Hive's military machine running day to day. They had not been looking for the places that were defended. They had been looking for the places that were not. Hassan had spent those 2 years in planning meetings, in simulation rooms, in long, quiet sessions with maps spread across every surface, tracing routes and testing scenarios, and asking the same question over and over in different forms. What breaks this? And how do we get there without being seen? He was not, by nature, a dramatic person. He did not talk about revenge. He did not give speeches to his crew about what had been done to Kessler's world, did not invoke the names of the dead before missions, or put them on the walls of the briefing rooms. He kept the list on his data pad, updated and complete, and he looked at it sometimes when he was alone. That was enough. What he told his crew, simply and repeatedly, was this: we are not here to win a battle. We are here to make this unsustainable for them. There is a difference. The fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel above Keth 3 on a morning cycle, when the shipyard's operations were at their highest, and the sensor operators had been on shift long enough to be slightly less sharp than they'd been at the start. The HFY defense systems registered the arrivals 0.4 seconds after they appeared. Alerts went out. Patrol wings were scrambled. The shipyard's emergency protocols engaged. Hassan's fleet did not wait for any of that to fully activate. 11 minutes and 40 seconds later, the primary construction bays at Keth 3 were gone. The fuel storage network, which had taken 8 years to build and supplied roughly 30% of the Grand Hive's active fleet, was gone. The testing facilities, the dry docks, the administrative core of the entire operation gone. The workers had been given exactly enough warning to evacuate. Not more, not less. Every exit had been left open. The surrounding patrol ships had been disabled rather than destroyed. Then Hassan's fleet jumped back out, and the space above Keth 3 was empty again. The High Commander of the Vrethkai Grand Hive received the battle report in his private chamber. He read it 3 times. Then he sat with it for a long while. Not speaking, not moving. What disturbed him most was not the scale of the damage, though the damage was severe. What disturbed him was the timing. The scout fleet had vanished months ago. The depot had been stripped. The relays had gone dark. His people had been watching, investigating, tightening their defenses. And the entire time, the humans had not been trying to get past those defenses at all. They had been doing something else entirely, somewhere else, moving through the places nobody was watching. They had been patient, methodical, invisible. And when they finally struck, when they finally showed their hand, it was not in a place the Grand Hive had been protecting. It was in the place they had assumed was safe. He thought about the human ambassador's words, the ones everyone had laughed at. 3 years ago, "We do not stop." He thought about that for a long time. Then he called his council together and told them to start preparing contingency plans. Not for a single engagement, not for a border skirmish or a localized dispute, for a long campaign. Because something in him, the part that had spent his whole life reading enemies correctly, told him this was not close to finished. It had not even properly started. The Conclave had seen wars before. In 800 years of recorded interstellar history, there had been 17 major conflicts between member civilizations and dozens of smaller ones. The Conclave had developed entire frameworks for understanding how these things went, the escalation patterns, the negotiation windows, the points at which a conflict became too costly for both sides, and the diplomatic machinery could move in. War, in the galactic sense, was ugly and wasteful. But it was also somewhat predictable. It had a shape. What was happening in Vrethkai space did not have a familiar shape. After Keth 3, the Conclave's military observers began paying very close attention. They had access to reports from both sides. Earth's delegation filed nothing, as usual, but the Vrethkai were requesting assistance through back channels, and those requests told their own story. The picture that assembled itself over the weeks following the shipyard strike was not what anyone had expected. There was no front line. In every conflict the Conclave had studied, there were fronts, places where forces met, where territory was contested, where the fighting happened and the map could be drawn. You could look at a conflict and point to where things stood. You could measure progress or setback in terms of ground held or lost. Human forces were not holding or contesting ground. They were appearing and disappearing. A fuel depot in the HFY's third system was found stripped and offline on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday, there was no trace of who had done it. A communication hub serving the Grand Hive's Eastern Fleet cluster was disabled so precisely that the engineers who came to repair it spent 2 days trying to figure out how it had been done before they could even begin to fix it. A convoy of military supply ships traveling between two HFY systems simply never arrived, and the ships were later found intact, engines disabled, sitting in a slow drift in empty space with their crews unharmed. Intact, unharmed, just stopped. That detail unsettled people more than almost anything else. An enemy that could have destroyed something and chose not to was harder to understand than one that simply destroyed everything it touched. It suggested a level of control, of deliberateness, that most species at war did not demonstrate. It suggested that whatever was happening was being carefully managed toward a specific outcome. Senior military scholars at 3 of the conclave's oldest institutions began pulling every piece of documented human history they could access. They went back centuries back to when humans were fighting only each other, on a single world. With primitive technology, they read campaign histories, studied battle records, analyzed conflicts that Earth itself had long since moved past. What they found made several of them deeply uneasy in ways they struggled to explain clearly to their colleagues. Humans, it turned out, did not have a strong tradition of the kind of war most galactic civilizations understood: the decisive engagement, the battle that ends things, the moment where one side breaks and the other claims victory. That model existed in human history, but it was not the most consistent thread running through it. The more consistent thread was something else, something the scholars found themselves circling around in their notes, without quite landing on a single word for it. Persistence, endurance, the willingness to absorb loss and keep going, the ability to fight without resolution for years, sometimes decades, never fully winning and never fully stopping. And underneath all of that, a particular kind of strategic thinking, not about how to win the next battle, but about how to make the entire situation unworkable for the other side. How to take apart the systems and structures that an enemy depended on, slowly and thoroughly, until the enemy could no longer function the way they needed to function. One scholar wrote in her report, "Humans do not appear to fight to defeat an enemy. They fight to make an enemy incapable of continuing." There is a difference, and it matters enormously. Her colleagues argued about the distinction for weeks, but the more they watched what was unfolding in HFY space, the harder it became to disagree with her. The HFY's fleet coordination was degrading, not because their ships had been destroyed in great numbers. Relatively few ships had been lost directly, but the networks that kept their fleet informed, supplied, and synchronized were being taken apart piece by piece. Relay stations went dark. Supply lines became unreliable. Patrol schedules that had run smoothly for decades began to slip because the information systems underpinning them were no longer dependable. It was like watching someone quietly remove all the joints from a structure. The walls were still standing. The roof was still there, but nothing was holding together the way it was supposed to, and every week there were more gaps, more failures, more places where the system bent and did not quite spring back. And then came the news about the people from Kessler's world. The 17,211 colonists who had been taken by the HFY fleet 3 years ago had been distributed across several labor installations in the Grand Hive's interior systems. They had been there ever since, working, surviving, largely forgotten by a galaxy that had moved on to other concerns. They were not forgotten by everyone. Over a period of 11 days, in a series of operations that the conclave observers struggled to reconstruct even after the fact, every single one of those installations was reached. The people inside were located, gathered, and moved. Quietly, without triggering any of the Grand Hive's alarm systems, in a way that brought a response fast enough to matter. 11 days, 17,211 people, every name on the list, accounted for. The conclave observer who filed the initial report on the recovery operation read it back to herself 3 times after writing it, because she was not sure anyone would believe the numbers. Then she sent it anyway, with a note attached that said simply, "Back in the conclave chambers, the mood had shifted considerably from where it had been 3 years earlier. Nobody was laughing now. The species that had offered condolences after Kessler's world and then quietly gone back to their own business were now watching everything very carefully. Several of them had opened private communications with Earth's delegation, not formal diplomatic overtures, just quiet conversations, checking in, paying attention in a way they had not before. A few of the smaller civilizations that had long-standing border concerns with the HFY suddenly found themselves wondering whether it might be worth strengthening certain relationships with humanity. Nothing official, nothing announced. Just a recalibration of who in this galaxy was worth taking seriously. Ambassador Voss received all of these quiet approaches with the same steady politeness she brought to everything. She was not triumphant about any of it. She did not point out that she had told them. She listened, responded thoughtfully, and filed her own reports back to Earth without editorial comment. But she noticed. In the HFY Grand Hive, the Security Council was meeting almost daily now. The reports coming in from across their space painted a picture that was difficult to look at directly. Infrastructure failures up significantly across 17 systems, fleet readiness down in 4 of their major command sectors. 2 colony worlds reporting that their routine supply runs had become unreliable enough to cause real shortages. And the human forces, wherever they were, whatever they looked like, however many of them there were, remained essentially invisible. No captured ships, no intercepted communications, no prisoners, nothing to push back against. One of the council members said, at the end of a particularly grim session, "We cannot fight what we cannot find." Nobody disagreed. The High Commander had been thinking about something for weeks, something that had been sitting at the edge of his thoughts since the night he read the Keth 3 report and could not stop hearing those 3 sentences from the human ambassador's communique. "We have recorded the names of everyone lost." He had assumed, when that message was sent, that it was rhetoric. The kind of thing you say in the aftermath of a loss because it sounds strong and decisive, and it plays well for your own people. He had assumed the names were symbolic, a gesture, a statement, not a literal operational commitment. He understood now that he had been wrong about that. Every single name. Recovered. Accounted for. In 11 days. Which meant that list had existed from the very beginning. Which meant that from the moment Commander Hassan had stood in the ash of Kessler's world and opened his datapad, the recovery of those people had been part of the plan. Not an afterthought. Not a bonus. Part of the plan. The High Commander thought about what kind of people build a plan like that. What kind of civilization decides, before it even begins fighting, that it will bring every single one of its people home and then does it? He found that he did not have a good answer. And that uncertainty, more than any battle report, more than any infrastructure assessment, more than any strategic projection his analysts could produce, that uncertainty was the thing that kept him awake. The request came through a back channel, not through the Conclave's formal communication system, not through any official diplomatic wire. It came quietly, in a coded transmission routed through 3 intermediary relay stations, addressed to Earth's delegation, and marked with a classification level that meant, "This is not for anyone else." The Vrethkai Grand Hive was asking for talks. Ambassador Voss read the transmission twice, then set it down and looked out the window of her office for a long moment. Outside, the Conclave's central station turned slowly against the stars, its lights steady and indifferent. She had sat in this office for 5 years now. She had watched the galaxy react to humanity in all kinds of ways, with amusement, with skepticism, with quiet recalibration, and now, with this. A private message from the most powerful military civilization that had ever laughed at her, asking to talk. She sent a single word back. Agreed. The talks took 6 weeks to arrange, and another 3 weeks to complete. They were held on neutral ground, in a station belonging to one of the older conclave species who had no particular interest in the outcome and could be trusted to keep the proceedings clean. No press. No observers. Just delegations, translators, and the slow, careful business of working out terms. The Vrethkai came to those talks in a different way than they had come to the conclave chamber 3 years ago, when their ambassador had used the word regrettable 4 times and never once said sorry. That version of the Vrethkai had been comfortable, certain of their position, confident that the machinery of galactic diplomacy would absorb the situation the way it had absorbed everything else. The delegation that sat across the table in those private talks was not comfortable. They were not broken either. The Grand Hive was still powerful, still functional, still a civilization of enormous size and capability. But 41 months of watching their infrastructure quietly come apart, 41 months of not being able to find what was doing it, not being able to stop it, not being able to predict where it would appear next had done something to their certainty. It had introduced a kind of doubt that military strength alone cannot resolve. The projections their analysts had been running for the past several months all pointed in the same direction. If things continued as they were going, their fleet readiness would fall below functional threshold within 2 years. Their supply chains to 3 outer colony worlds were already compromised beyond easy repair. Their communication networks, which had taken generations to build into the reliable system they depended on, would require decades of reconstruction, even if the disruptions stopped tomorrow. The disruptions showed no sign of stopping tomorrow. So they sat down, and they talked. The terms that came out of those 3 weeks were not gentle, but they were not designed to humiliate. Earth had asked for specific things, clearly and without drama. Full reparations to every family from Kessler's world. Reconstruction funding for the colony itself. A formal acknowledgement in the official conclave record of what the Vrethkai had done, and a binding agreement placing the Kessler system permanently under human jurisdiction with a security guarantee backed by 3 other conclave species. The Vrethkai accepted all of it. There was no argument about the reparations figure. There was very little negotiation about anything, really. The Vrethkai delegation made a few requests about the language of the formal acknowledgement they wanted. Certain phrases softened, certain details framed differently. Earth's delegation reviewed each request, accepted some, declined others, and explained clearly which was which and why. It was businesslike. It was, in its own strange way, respectful. The first reparations payment reached the surviving families of Kessler's world within the week of signing. The formal cessation proceedings were held in the conclave chambers. It had to be there. The acknowledgement needed to be entered into the official record, witnessed by all member civilizations. There was no way to do that quietly. The chamber was fuller than it had been in years. Word had traveled, as it always did, and species that rarely attended general sessions had sent their senior representatives. The gallery was packed. The translation drones hummed. The lighting cycled through its slow shifts, accommodating 47 different kinds of eyes. The Vrethkai delegation stood and made their formal acknowledgement. It was read into the record. The language was precise and plain, no softening had survived that mattered, and it named what had been done at Kessler's world without flinching from what the words meant. The chamber was very quiet while they read it. When it was done, Ambassador Voss was invited to speak for Earth. She walked to the center of the chamber. The same chamber, the same spot where she had stood 5 years ago and been laughed at by the better part of a galaxy. She looked out at the same gallery. The same faces, older now, some of them, and watching her very differently than they had that first day. She did not carry notes. She never did. She stood there for a moment in the quiet, and then she said what she had come to say. 5 years ago, I stood in this room and told you who we are. I told you we are slow to anger, that we do not forget, and that we do not stop. I was not making a threat. I was not performing strength we did not have. I was telling you the truth about us, as clearly and honestly as I could, because I believed you deserved to know it before anything else happened. She looked around the gallery slowly. What happened next at Kessler's world, and everything that followed, I wish none of it had been necessary. I mean that. 17,000 people spent 3 years in places they should never have been. Children grew up away from the world they were born on. Families were separated for years. Nothing that has been agreed in these proceedings gives any of that time back. She paused. The chamber stayed silent, but every single one of those people came home. Every name on the list. That was not luck, and it was not an accident. It was a choice we made before we did anything else that we would not leave without bringing them back. All of them. That is also who we are. She looked out one more time at the gallery. We told you who we were. We hope you believe us now. She walked back to her seat. The silence that followed was not like the silence after her first speech 5 years ago, the brief, suspended pause before the laughter started. This was a different kind of silence. The kind that settles over a room when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, when the air itself seems to need a moment to rearrange around the weight of the words. Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke for a long time. The recording of that moment, Ambassador Voss standing in the center of the conclave chamber, delivering those 4 sentences to a packed gallery that did not make a sound, traveled farther and faster than the original clip had 5 years before. It reached every system in the conclave within days. It was translated into every language the conclave recognized, and several that it did not. It was taught to children on dozens of worlds not as a lesson about war, but as a lesson about something harder to name, about what it means to say something true and mean it completely, and then go and prove it. The junior HFY diplomat, who had made the barking planet joke years earlier, had long since stopped telling it. He had stopped before the talks. Actually, sometime around the 4th month of watching the reports come in from across Grand Hive space, each one a little worse than the last. The joke had not felt clever for a long time. He did not talk about it. He watched the proceedings in the conclave chamber from his office, alone, on a small screen. He watched Voss walk to the center of the room. He watched her say what she said. He watched the gallery sit in that particular silence. He thought about the archived transcript of his own words, time-stamped and filed in the official record. He thought about it for a while. Then he closed the feed and got back to work. Commander Hassan heard the news of the agreement from a communications officer who knocked on the door of his temporary quarters and told him, simply, that it was done. He thanked the officer, closed the door, and sat down. He opened his datapad, found the file. The list, 17,211 names. All of them marked, every single one. He looked at it for a long time, not reading it, just looking. He had carried that list for 5 years. Through the planning, through the campaign, through the long and careful work of finding every person on it and getting them out, it had never left his datapad. He had looked at it more times than he could count. He did not delete it. He saved it to a permanent archive, added a final timestamp, and put the datapad down on the table beside him. Outside the window of his quarters, Kessler's world was visible from orbit, green and brown and blue. The river basin catching the light. The low mountains along the edge of the frame. From up here, you could not see the new construction yet, the foundations being laid where the old settlements had been. But it was happening. People were going back. The trees that had been old enough to provide shade before the attack, some of them had survived. Not many, but some. He sat and looked at it for a while. Back in the conclave, things were different now, not transformed overnight, not suddenly simple, but different in the ways that matter and tend to last. Species that had laughed at humanity's warning, or stood by while Kessler's world burned, or offered condolences and moved on. They had all done the math. They had all watched what happened and drawn their conclusions. Nobody questioned Earth's warnings after that. Not openly, not quietly. When humanity's delegation spoke in that chamber, the room listened in the particular way that people listen when they have learned firsthand, at real cost to someone, that the words being said are exactly what they appear to be. No more, no less. Just the truth. Said once, meant completely,